Everyone has heard a story that stays with them long after it's told. These 7 horror stories come from first-hand experiences and local anecdotes shared by people who still can't quite explain what happened. If you enjoy this kind of thing, consider liking, subscribing, and turning on the bell. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. I was driving a long, empty stretch of highway at dusk, my partner asleep in the passenger seat and the heater doing most of the talking. We'd been on the road for hours, the kind of road that eats the sky and leaves only a hard, thin strip of asphalt. We were somewhere out of town but still on the main route, no shoulders to speak of, just trees crowding right up to the road. I remember thinking how nothing about the evening looked like anything could happen. Everything looked ordinary enough to lull you into not watching. Then I saw something on the shoulder ahead and slowed without deciding to. At first, it read like a pile of clothing propped up, a silhouette awkward against the pines. As we got closer, I told myself it was a deer that had somehow picked a wrong stance or a hunter's jacket left on a post. The closer we came, the more wrong that idea felt. It didn't move when our headlights swept across it. It didn't shift when a truck rumbled past in the other lane a minute later. It just stood there, rigid and deliberately still, like a mannequin someone had abandoned to the shoulder. My partner woke up when I hit the brakes. We both watched it for a heartbeat. 2 people in a small car with a strange thing at the side of the road. I almost laughed because the whole thing looked ridiculous at first. Someone had stacked a coat on a post and stuck a ball cap on top. But the closer we pulled, the less tidy it looked. Its proportions were wrong. Too long in the torso, with shoulders that sloped in a way fabric doesn't naturally slump. It wore clothes that had no folds where they should, no hint of a spine or breathing. It looked made. We slowed to maybe 10 miles an hour and I reflexively reached for my phone. The thing was close enough now that I could see it had no face, just an empty, pale oval where a face should have been. I said aloud that it looked like a mannequin. My partner said the same thing, quietly, the kind of whisper that's not sure it wants to be heard. I eased the car past, leaving maybe 6 feet between us and that figure. The air felt thick the whole way by, like it had weight. We drove a little farther down the road and I kept looking in the rear view like an idiot. It was still there, exactly where we'd left it, unmoving as if whatever object it was had been painted onto the shoulder. We joked nervously about pranksters, about bored kids and hunting lures, but the jokes sounded hollow to both of us. When we hit the next turnout, I put the car in park, flipped on the hazard lights, and told my partner I was going to go check it out. They tried to stop me, said it was late and stupid, but I told them I wasn't going to leave it. Left what? I didn't say. I told myself I was being rational. If someone was hurt or stranded, you stop. It was a thin, sensible lie I told myself to get out of the car. The shoulder was colder than the air inside the car. Up close, the figure looked like something stitched together out of misused materials. The clothes were real. An old jacket, pants, but the way they hung was off, like the fabric had been starched into a pose. Where a face should be, there was a smooth, pale curve that caught the light in a way skin doesn't. I circled it once and noticed the gloves, empty, stuffed, and pinned at odd angles. No footprints led to it from the woods, and none led away from it. The ground around it held nothing but compacted gravel. I wanted to laugh then, because it felt necessary to puncture the moment with something normal. But my laugh died thin. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from work, the sort you normally ignore. My partner was pacing back by the car, voice low, telling me to come on. I wanted to say something brave, like, it's probably just an art project, but instead I said, look at the hands, because they were the strangest part. The gloves looked like hands, but they were too small, too neat. Some animal had been dressed up to look human. When we slid back into the car, I told myself we were done with it. My partner started the engine and I watched the figure pull into the mirror like a thing that couldn't be right. About a mile down the road, we passed an intersection lit dimly by a single street lamp. A small group of people stood there, talking in a cluster. The kind of cluster that looks casual until you notice one person in the middle isn't moving at all. We slowed because seeing people in the middle of nowhere demands you slow. One of them gestured toward the shoulder behind us, and my partner jerked their head around. By the time I cut the wheel, backed up, and pulled over, the cluster had thinned. The figure on the shoulder was gone. There was no sign it had been picked up. The space stood as if no thing had been there at all. We got out and called across the road to a man wearing a work jacket. His answer was clipped. He said he and a couple others had left a mannequin there earlier that week as a joke, one of those discarded store forms. He said someone had reported it as a prowler a few nights before, so they put it back again to see what would happen. The way he said it made no sense to me, like those words were an explanation he'd tried on and found flat. We didn't stay to argue. The group dispersed and left us with the shoulder and the smell of diesel. The mannequin explanation fit in a tidy box. Prank, roadside oddity, someone with a warped sense of humor. But later that night, parked in a motel and replaying it, something clicked in a quieter place. A different neighbor from that stretch of road had posted about a missing person a few days prior. Someone seen hitchhiking, last spotted near that same highway. The missing person's details did not match the mannequin's obvious features, but the timing pressed at the back of my mind like a dull tooth. I checked the local feed until my eyes were raw and found a thread where someone else had driven past that shoulder at midday and said the thing had been standing there, staring at the road, for hours. We left the next morning, trying not to look behind us. The shoulder went by the same as all the rest. Trees, the thin line of asphalt, the sky a flat sheet above. We drove past the spot again and there was nothing. Sometimes we would point out a loose rock or a patch of gravel and say nothing. I don't know if the mannequin was ever collected for disposal, or if it stood there still long after we were gone. I only know the image kept returning, not as a memory, but as a presence in the periphery of thought, an imitation of a person left in the place where people should be safe to travel. I never learned the full story. A few weeks later, there was a brief post about someone found a good distance off the road, disoriented and with no clear memory, but the write-up was thin. The police note on the local page vanished within 48 hours without explanation. I read every little scrap left in comment threads and on feeds until the dates blurred. The thing on the shoulder became one of those small, stubborn blanks you carry in your head because you have nothing else to do with it. I worked as the winter caretaker for a little maintenance cabin out where the trees thin and the road stops. It was the kind of job you take because you like being alone and because the company pays you to stay put, check the pumps, tend the generator, clear a path once in a while. My shifts were 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Most nights were quiet in that specific, heavy way only cold places have, everything muffled, everything edged in white. One night in late January, about a week into my rotation, there was a knock on the door around midnight. That alone felt wrong. People don't travel out that way after dark in winter unless something's gone sideways. I opened up, and there was a man, bundled tight against the cold, eyes wide. He said his truck had slid off the access road and he'd been walking since dusk. He sounded rational, not drunk, not high, just tired and rattled. I let him in and gave him coffee. He thanked me like he'd been rescued. I put him on the couch and told him he could sleep it off. He kept insisting he just needed a place to warm up while he waited for dawn, and he kept checking his phone even though there was no signal. He told me his name, Mason, but I didn't pry. He seemed grateful and honest in a way that made me relax. We traded small talk until both of us nodded off. When I woke around 5, the cabin felt wrong in the way quiet places sometimes do after an interruption, like a room that someone rearranged while you slept. The stove was cold, The front window had a misted patch where someone had been standing. I went to the doorway to let light in and found a ring of footprints in the snow, circling the cabin close to the walls and then cutting off into the tree line. Bare footprints, no boots. They were human-shaped but elongated, toes a little too long, stride uneven, as if whoever made them had been dragging something. Mason was still asleep on the couch when I checked him. He stirred when I shook him and said he was fine. I asked if he wanted me to call someone. He muttered that his truck was only a few miles down and he'd go get it in the morning. He sounded confident enough that I believed him. I went to the shed to get some extra wood and found the generator compartment had been opened. The battery was gone. Not broken, not drained, gone. The latch was untouched, as if somebody had simply lifted it free. I told Mason about the footprints and the missing battery. His face drained. He said he hadn't left the cabin after coming in. He offered to walk back out to the truck with me to check it, and I almost agreed, then remembered the weather report on my tablet. More snow coming in, visibility bad. I said we should stay until morning supply run. He argued a little, then shrugged and sat down. We tried to keep busy. We ate a quick breakfast, patched up a board on the window, stacked wood. At noon, when the supply driver didn't show, I started to worry. The radio was static, just odd hissing in the frequency where I'd usually get a check-in. Mason said he'd go look for the truck, that it was right past the ravine. I told him no. He went anyway. He was gone maybe an hour. I sat by the door and watched the tree line until my eyes hurt. When he came back, he moved slow, shoulders forward against the cold. He smelled faintly of smoke, like a campfire that had long burned out. He didn't make eye contact. He walked straight past me and into the bathroom without saying a word. A while later, he came out and told me he'd found the truck, but he didn't remember walking there. He could only remember standing by the ravine and then waking up with his hands bloody and his gloves missing. He had a bruise on his wrist like someone had wrapped a hand around it. He kept touching it like he expected to feel something that wasn't there. I asked him what had happened when he went to the truck. He said he didn't know. He said he'd seen tracks leading away from the truck into the trees, and that they didn't look like any animal or person he knew. Something about the way he said that made the air in the room thicken. We sat in silence until the light outside started to go blue. I was halfway through making tea when the floorboard in the hallway creaked. I looked up and saw him standing there, but his face wasn't the same. I couldn't point to what changed. Maybe the way his gaze flicked over the room as if he was checking entrances. Maybe the set of his jaw. But it was like someone had replaced the man I'd let sleep on the couch with a version who had holes in his memory and edges where there should have been softness. That night we kept every light on. We double-checked the locks and pushed the couch up against the door like a poor barricade. At around 2 in the morning I woke to a soft sound at the back window. I went to check and found a smudge of melted snow where a palm had rested and then run, heading toward the woods. The snow around the cabin had more of those elongated barefoot prints. They were deeper now, as if whoever made them had been heavier or had been pulling something. The next morning, the truck at the bottom of the drive was there and undamaged, but its headlights were off, and there was no one in it. There were drag marks in the snow leading from the truck toward the rocks by the creek, like someone had dragged something awkwardly across the ground. Mason found some pieces of fabric snagged on branches. He said he recognized the weave, his coat, the one he'd been wearing that night. He kept saying he remembered running through the trees, then a long black shape moving overhead, then nothing until he was back at the ravine. We managed to get the supply driver on the radio late afternoon when the snow thinned enough for a signal. The driver came by and stayed a respectful distance, eyes darting, asking few questions. He wouldn't sleep over. He took Mason's statement like a formal thing. Notes, a nod, then a promise to report it. After he left, Mason grew quieter. He would stand at the window sometimes and watch the tree line, but he never explained what he hoped to see. He kept rubbing the bruise on his wrist and sometimes tracing the scar on his palm with his thumb, as if trying to pull a memory free. By the end of my rotation, Mason had left. He said he was going to town to see someone about the wrist and to talk to people who knew the roads better. He took his truck. Before he drove away, he turned and said, "If this happens to you, don't go looking." He didn't elaborate. I stayed 3 more winters after that shift, and every winter I would clear a path around the cabin and find old, faint rings of disturbed snow where a set of footprints had circled and then disappeared. Once I found a single, long glove buried under a drift near the creek. I mailed it out with my next run. A few months later, I saw a photo in a local paper. Mason, a little older, with a bandage on his wrist, standing by a patrol truck. He was smiling like someone who'd chosen to move on. The story printed beside it was thin and clinical. Truck stuck, hypothermia risk mitigated, man treated and released. Nothing about elongated footprints or doors opened from the inside. I don't know what followed him out of those trees that night. I only know what I saw. The missing battery, the footsteps that didn't match any boot, the way someone can sleep in a place and wake with pieces gone. I know the bruise he kept tracing like a remnant of something that was neither man nor animal. I know the look on his face when he left, like he'd already decided not to come back. I worked as a deckhand on a set-net boat for a summer season. Our crew was small, captain, 1 mate, and me. We ran the same stretch of coastline every day, checking the nets at dawn and again in the evening, hauling fish into the skiff, fixing floats, keeping an eye on weather that could change without warning. It was routine the way a machine is routine, predictable, repetitive, safe, until it wasn't. One late July evening, we were coming back from a long day. The sun had gone down, but there was still light, that flat, even glow you only get up north in summer. We idled through a narrow channel between 2 islands, nets stowed, the engine humming low. The mate was below fixing a snarl in a line, and the captain was at the helm. I was on the bow, cleaning gear. My handheld VHF radio buzzed. Static. Then a voice cutting through on a channel that was usually quiet. It said my first name clearly. It sounded like my brother. I froze and looked back at the cabin because his voice was the last person I expected to hear over these waters. The voice said the word again, and then coordinates, calm and precise, as if relaying the place of something that needed immediate attention. The tone was urgent but steady, like someone reading from a checklist. The captain heard it too. He asked who was transmitting. The radio gave nothing but the channel's low hiss. We switched to the channel the voice had used, and nothing but static answered. The mate climbed up and shrugged, saying maybe it was a pickup from shore or some guy testing equipment. Still, the captain put the boat on a slow course toward the coordinates the voice had given. It was only a few miles out of our way, and we were already out. As we approached the marked spot, the sea looked ordinary. Small swell, no debris, nothing floating except kelp. The mate called out, "Nothing here," then pointed. There was a skiff bobbing a little, nose down, taking on water. Up close, we saw an open cooler and fishing gear scattered. The motor was still attached, but not running. No one was in the boat. The mate pulled the skiff alongside and we climbed aboard. The captain checked the motor, then the hull, then the transom, and cursed under his breath when he found a ragged cut along the gunwale where rope had been ripped free. There was a puddle of dark matter near the seat. It was old and congealed, not fresh enough to be obvious blood, but not clean either. On the floor of the skiff, someone had left a single rubber glove, turned inside out. We called the Coast Guard, gave our position, and started a search pattern around the area. The captain wanted to take the skiff and circle while we called other boats, but he also wanted to stay near the scene. There were pebbles of panic that started at the edges of our crew and grew as minutes passed. The radio remained quiet except for static and the distant echo of other channels. A small rescue crew showed up within the hour. They ran cameras and took notes and asked questions in a detached way that made us answer quicker than we wanted to. They asked if we recognized the skiff. We didn't. They bagged the glove and towed the boat to the nearest harbor. They told us to write statements and to go home and sleep if we could. The captain lit a cigarette on the rail and stared at the water for a long time. That night, the three of us shared stew in the bunk room and tried to keep the conversation small. The mate kept glancing at the radio like it might speak again. Outside, the channel lights winked on at the buoys. Around midnight, the handheld crackled once, soft as breath, and a voice said the mate's name. It was the exact timbre of his sister, the one who'd called him every Sunday. He sat upright and stared at the device until the batteries went dead in his hands. He swore to me he hadn't been out to make a prank call. 2 days later, a different boat found a boot on a shoreline some distance away from the skiff's last known position. It was a single boot, waterlogged, a style common to fishermen. The Coast Guard came through again with questions and a broader search, but there were no signs of a body, no prints on the beaches that matched a struggle, no GPS pings. The captain said the currents in those channels can do strange things, move things faster than you think. The mate kept his mouth shut. People talked in the harbor, quiet conversations over coffee. Someone saying the radio sometimes picks up stray signals from far away. Another person mentioning how the channel used to carry someone's old weather broadcast and sometimes voices from decades ago would leak through. A few told us not to go near abandoned skiffs. Most kept a polite distance. We stayed out for the rest of the week because pulling sets pays the bills. Each morning, the mate tuned the handheld to every channel he could think to check, scanning for a voice that might explain. At night, he slept with the radio within reach. He stopped answering his sister's calls for a while and later told me he couldn't bring himself to pick up until he knew who he was talking to. Weeks later, the Coast Guard returned the skiff to a pier after forensic tests turned up nothing conclusive. The glove was sent for analysis and came back inconclusive. The official report said unidentified vessel, likely drift, missing person reported. There was a number to call if anyone had new information. The mate left at the end of the season. He left his berth without fanfare and didn't come back the next year. I heard later that he moved inland to work construction and that some nights, when he drove home from the job, he turned the radio off altogether. I used to see him at the dock sometimes when the season changed over. He'd stand a long time looking out at the channel, then climb into his truck and drive away. Months after the skiff, I was alone on a routine check and the handheld picked up a voice calling the captain's name. It sounded like a voicemail left on loop, saying nothing but the name and then coordinates that pointed to a shallow inlet where the tide shifts like a trap. I wrote the coordinates down, threw the radio in a locker, and left without checking. The captain told me later he'd had the same call, but he never told me where he'd gone after. He just smiled and said some things are better unlooked at. I ran barefoot into the street with my hands cuffed and my shoes gone. I remember the cold biting the soles of my feet and a car stopping like it couldn't decide whether to be kind or afraid. A stranger pulled me in and I told him I was tied to a man who kept me at his place and would not let me leave. That's how it started for me, not with some slow realization, but with the simple fact of getting free and asking for help. For a while before that, he had seemed like the kind of man you met at a bar and then forgot. He was polite and quiet, not loud like some of the locals. He said he had a little plane and a cabin where we could get away from people for a weekend. He said it like an offer, not a threat. I believed him enough to go. I did what a lot of people do when they want to get away. I let someone else make the plan. That was a decision I would spend the next hours regretting. When I woke up at his place, it wasn't the cabin I had pictured. The house had a back bedroom with a bed bolted to the floor and a map with tiny marks hidden away. He had a way of moving around that made me notice the details people usually miss. He had a small collection of things that belonged to other women, things he kept in a box where he could look at them. He talked about hunting like someone who thought the word made a person into an animal. He called it a test of skill. He said he wanted to see how someone would handle being out on their own. The first night I tried to leave quietly, but the door was locked from the outside. He had a habit of watching out windows even when he was sitting at the table. He asked me questions about my life like he was cataloging answers he could use later. He made me eat, he made me sleep, and he chained a set of cuffs to something heavy in the floor so I couldn't bolt in the night. He explained rules as if we were playing a game, saying I could move only when he told me, and that was supposed to be comforting for him and terrifying for me. I remember the way he laughed sometimes, a short, low sound that did not match anything else he said. He kept a rifle in the closet and an airplane he used to fly people around. There were nights he'd say we were going to take a trip, and mornings the plane would sit unused, as if the idea of the plane was part of the equipment for his control. Once he took me out to a field and released me, then followed at a distance, watching to see which direction I ran. He called it a test of survival. He thought of it like practice. The first time he did that, I burst into tears and kept running until my legs gave out. He laughed softly behind me and then walked me back. The moment I got loose was not cinematic. It was small and messy and happened because of a mistake he made. He left the door open after someone knocked, a strange thing for a man who treated doors like locks on boxes. I slipped out barefoot while he argued with the person at the threshold and ran until I found someone who would help. I managed to get to a place where people could call someone with a phone and breathe into a space that felt normal. I told them what happened. They called the authorities, and later I identified him from a photo. I said his name to the man who drove me away, and later the same name was on a list of charges and a case that people in our state remembered. It turned out afterwards that he was not just someone with bad intentions, but someone who had done this before. There were other women who had gone missing and items that didn't add up. They found a map with marks that did not belong to a casual traveler. They found the back of a bed headboard where someone had hidden a paper with tiny crosses, and later those marks matched places where bodies were found. He used the same pattern: gain trust, offer an escape, isolate, then leave the person to fend for themselves in the wilderness. For some, it ended with them running and getting home. For others, it did not. After he was caught and charged, there were interviews and a slow, horrible parsing of what he'd done. Men I had seen him talk to at the store would say they never would have guessed. Women who had worked nights or in bars began calling police with pieces of their own stories. Detectives took the map out of the house and drove to coordinates with search teams. Bodies that had been missing for months were found in places marked in that headboard. The network of evidence was a thing you could point to and say, this is what he did and this is where. When they finally moved him out of town, the community felt an odd quiet, like a storm had passed and left a changed landscape. People who had been cautious before became more watchful in a different way, the kind of watchfulness that keeps doors bolted and plans more public. There were interviews, there were books, and there was a film that showed the sequence of events as if they could be captured and understood. That was not my experience of it. My experience was the night I ran barefoot, the way the road scraped the skin from the soles of my feet, and the voice of the man who pulled me into his car, who asked me what happened and then drove me to safety like it was the most normal thing to do. I was 28 and had just taken over the little homestead my great-grandfather staked out back before anyone bothered with roads. I wanted cheap land and a place to work on my woodworking. The house was a long, low thing patched together over decades, and the back property ran into a swamp no one liked to go near after dark. Folks in town said the swamp kept to itself, and that was the end of it. I learned quick that when people finish a sentence like that, it usually means they're holding something back. The first weirdness came a few nights after my first winter alone. I woke up at 3 in the morning because the wood stove had gone out and the room chilled faster than it should. I went to stand up and figured my keys were on the table, but sitting on the table was a small folded piece of paper with a name on it. It was the name of a girl who'd been born in that house a long time ago. I didn't know the name beyond vague family mentions, and I hadn't written it down anywhere. I put the paper in my jacket and went to the kitchen to relight the stove. The next morning, the paper was gone. I'm careful with my things out alone. Losing something like that makes the hair on the back of your neck lift. A week later, I heard someone out by the shed while I was stacking lumber. The dogs were sleeping in the house and my truck was where I left it. Whoever it was moved like they were wearing boots and knew how to sneak in snow. I went out and called, "Hey, you need anything?" There was no answer. On the ground by the shed were prints, but they weren't a normal boot tread. They were small and narrow, like someone wearing moccasins that had been worn smooth, and they led toward the tree line and then stopped. There was no path to a road from there. Anyone walking that way would have had to come back the same way. No return prints. I kept finding small things misplaced. A mitten in the laundry basket where I'd left a pair in the hall. A teacup turned upside down on the table when I'd left it right side up. One morning my bread was cut into exact, even slices, though I'd left the loaf whole. None of it felt malicious. It felt like someone moving through the house with a purpose that made no sense to me. When I mentioned it to my neighbor at the feed store, he didn't laugh. He told me not to go down to the swamp at dusk, not even to check the trail. He said there were stories about people getting lost down there for a day, sometimes two, always coming back the way they went, but not remembering specific hours. He said the swamp can put you in a fog. He said that like it was an old warning, nothing dramatic, and then he bought his feed and left. One night I saw someone standing at the edge of my property 30 yards from the back porch. They weren't moving, just standing. I thought it was a new neighbor or someone trying to get my attention. I put on my jacket and went outside because I wanted to ask why they were there. As I walked out, the porch light hit them, and I could see they were small, maybe a teenage kid, wearing a faded parka. When they turned toward me, their face looked like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. The features were there, but something about the skin wasn't right, like the color had been pulled out of it. I asked if they needed help. They said no, quietly, and then said something else that made my stomach drop. They asked if I could let them sit. I asked where, and they pointed toward the stump by the old birch tree. I told them they couldn't stay, that it was late and I was the only one there. They nodded like they understood and walked across the yard to the stump and sat, knees close to their chest. I went back inside and watched through the window. For the next hour, they sat there without moving, looking down at their hands. At some point, a fox crossed behind them. The person never acknowledged it. After an hour, they stood up and walked toward the tree line. Their footprints stopped where the grass met the dark, exactly like the others I'd seen by the shed. No sign of where they went from there. The weirdest night came when my cousin dropped by because the river bridge was iced over and he couldn't take his truck home. We were sitting at the kitchen table with a couple of beers talking about how to fix a sled runner when we both heard the little scratches at the back door, like someone sliding a fingernail across wood. The dogs didn't bark. They lay there like they knew it was nothing to get excited about. My cousin exchanged a look with me and said, "You hearing that too?" I opened the back door and there was a child's mitten sitting on the top step. It was clean, not wet, like it had been placed there just then. My cousin picked it up and said the name on the mitten. It was the same name from the folded paper I found the first week. He stood quiet for a long second, then dropped it back on the step and said he needed to check the truck. He didn't say why, and he left the house to walk his pickup like that was a casual thing. He came back pale and said he'd found the mittens in a patch of brush along the river, in a place where you'd expect them to be torn or soggy. These were not like that. They were dry and folded and smelled faintly of smoke. I put them in my pocket, but I didn't sleep that night. Days later, an old man who'd been in the area forever stopped by with a box of sugar because he thought the house looked cold. He told me a story my great-grandmother had told him once about a child who drowned in the swamp long ago. He said the family left offerings, a cup on the porch, a mitten hung on a nail, because sometimes the child would come knocking for things that belonged to the living. He said they never tried to chase the child off because the child was just a child, and children get lonely out there. He told the story like you would tell someone how the tides come in, a fact of the place. I don't know if what I saw was that child. I only know the pattern. Small things left in small places. boot prints that stopped without leaving an exit, a person standing in the dark who could sit for an hour without moving. I went down to the swamp once with a flashlight and a rope, intending to prove there was something physical there, but when I reached the edge, the fog rolled in low and I couldn't see 10 feet. My flashlight beam hit something that looked like fabric, and then the beam shifted and there was nothing. I started to feel sick to my stomach, so I uncoiled the rope and went back up the bank. After that, I started leaving a cup of coffee on the porch at night and sometimes a slice of bread on the table. The cup would be gone in the morning, right down to the lipstick rim if I'd been wearing any. The bread was sometimes eaten, sometimes cut, sometimes left whole. The mittens I kept in a drawer and took out when I had guests to show them, and the conversation always went quiet. People nodded and changed the subject. Once, a kid from town took one of the mittens and hung it on his backpack like a joke. The next day, he came back to my place and said he'd woken up 3 nights in a row to the feeling of someone sitting on the end of his bed. He put the mitten back on my step and didn't touch it again. I sold the homestead 2 summers later. I don't have a neat ending about the swamp or the girl. I sold it because I got a job in a city and I needed cash to move. But before the buyer signed the papers, I left a folded piece of paper with the name in the same place I'd found it all those months ago. I don't know if he found it. I don't know if he keeps the cup on the porch. I only know that for as long as I lived there, the small things happened in small ways that never escalated into violence and never made me feel hunted. Just watched and occasionally cared for in a way that didn't fit anything I had words for. I was 29 and working summers on a tender that ran between little canneries and fishing camps. One year, the captain took a job hauling gear out to a place the company called Port Chatham. It was one of those contracts that paid extra because the site had been empty for years and the owners wanted the rusted stuff removed before winter. I volunteered because extra cash meant a plane ticket home. The place looked like someone had put the town to sleep and never told it morning would never come. Old pilings, a broken fish wheel, a cannery shell that had lost most of its skin to wind and rain. We made camp in the shelter of the old landing, the tender tied off to a piling that leaned the way things lean when no one has tended them for a long time. The other guys were all city boys who liked to joke about ghosts. I kept my head down, worked the lines, and repaired the nets. We were 3 people sleeping in 2 bunks and 1 rolled tarp. The first night nothing happened beyond rats and the small complaints of an old building settling. On the second night the fog came in heavy. It swallowed sound the way a blanket swallows breath. The tide moved slow and the boat creaked. Around midnight I woke because something hit the hull hard enough to make the cook swear in his sleep. We all sat up and listened. After a minute we heard a noise that was not water or wood. It was a long, low sound, like a thing trying to talk and failing. It started far off and moved closer in a straight line along the shoreline, and when it paused, the scrub surrounding the cannery shivered with the vibration of it. We went out with a couple of flashlights and a single rifle, more for confidence than because we expected to use it. The lights skittered over enormous prints in the mud. I had seen bear tracks before. These were not bear prints. They were long, wide, and set perfectly in 2 columns as if a very large person had been walking upright. The stride between prints was longer than any man I knew could make sober. The prints led away from the cannery down the beach where the old fish wheels sat half overturned. One of the younger men swore he saw movement near the old wheel, and he backed up so fast his head hit the doorframe. He kept talking about hair in the wheel and fresh scratch marks along the wooden spokes. None of us slept after that. We kept the cook on watch, and he did not move from the stove. Dawn came thin, and the beach looked like another world. The fish wheel that had worked the headland for years was torn up, ropes shredded and metal bent like someone had used a crowbar for teeth marks. There were long gashes in the wheel timbers that no bear claw should make, and a circle of flattened grass where something heavy had crouched. Word moves slow where we were, but it moves. By the second day, some of the old-timers from the nearest town showed up in a skiff. They did not laugh. One of them had been born nearby, and he told us in a voice that did not try to make the story entertaining that the place had a name in his grandmother's language and that they did not go there unless they had to. He shrugged off our questions and said only that people left and did not come back for reasons that were not all about money. That night, I walked the beach alone because I could not stand the look of the broken wheel. I kept to the driftwood, and the light from my headlamp made a small pool on the sand. I found hair stuck in a splintered plank, dark and coarse and longer than any dog hair I'd seen. My hand went numb when I picked it up. It smelled of something sour, like metal and old fish, but different. I put it in my pocket and did not tell the others. When I reached the far edge of the beach, there was a clearing where someone had burned a small pile of driftwood. The flames had long died. Around the ash were footprints, and larger than the ones we had seen near the wheel. They came out of the woods and stopped 10 feet from the fire pit. The prints formed an arc, as if whatever had walked there had paced, and then Saturday I could see indentations where knees might have pressed into the sand. There were also marks, like someone had used their hands to steady themselves. They were the shape of big palms, spread and deliberate. I stood there for a long time listening. The fog was a wall that moved slowly and sometimes rolled in and out like wind in a child's blanket. When I finally turned back, the hair in my pocket had gone wet from the humidity and felt heavier. I did not take it out. I walked back to the tender and pretended to sleep. On the 4th day, a man from a survey crew who was staying in a tent at the edge of the trees did not show up to break camp. We found his tent slashed open, sleeping bag gone, but his boots left neatly by the stove. Tracks led from the tent toward the high ground and then stopped at the edge of a gully. There was a smear on a stump that looked like someone had tried to drag themselves up and failed. No blood, no belongings. The youngest of our crew started talking about leaving. The captain said no. Money was money, and there are contracts to fulfill. I watched his face when he thought no one was looking, and I saw how tired he was of making the decision. That night the thing walked the ridge. The sound it made carried down the bay and set the pilings to trembling. It was a high, keening cry that went up and down like a throat without rhythm. The tender rocked like a small animal in a bigger one's paws. I put 2 shells in the rifle and I sat against the hull with the weapon across my knees. When the cry stopped, we heard something move along the timbers close to the water and then the scrape of something heavy moving off into the fog. In the morning, the captain had already cut the lines and the tender was ready. We left with the last load of scrap and no one from the survey crew. The captain would not tell me if he had seen anything. He said nothing, only worked the winch and kept his mouth shut like anyone who has tried to explain the unexplainable. I did not look back at the town. The boat nosed through the fog and it felt like we were passing through a mouth. Years later, I told the story a few times in bars and at fish auctions, and the people who had been around Port Chatham told me parts of it matched other tales they'd heard. They said old nets vanished from lines, that dogs would not go to the shoreline there, that sometimes when the fog lifts you can see prints like someone hammered them into the mud. I never tried to find the surveyor again. I kept the hair in a jar for a while until my wife made me throw it out. She said it was disgusting. I grew up in a village up north, and I never really talked about some of the things I saw, but I'll tell this one straight. I was a teenager then, maybe 16, and we were out on the tundra trapping with my cousin for a week. It was late autumn, and the light stuck around in a long, thin way that makes everything look older than it is. We were packing the sled at dusk, fixing a runner that had slipped off, and the radio had gone dead, static like a throat clearing and then nothing. My cousin walked off a little ways to check the bait lines and I stayed with the sled, passing the time swapping cigarette butts back and forth even though my hands were numb. I knew the route well. I knew the rises and the shallow hollows where the muskeg would hold you if you wandered wrong. I wasn't worried about animals. What I didn't know was that something else kept to those rises. I first noticed it because the dog stopped. He was chewing on the harness, making that low sound dogs make when they're content. And then he popped his head up, and his whole body stiffened. He looked past me. I followed his line of sight and saw, maybe 70 yards off, a little figure sitting on one of the hummocks watching us. It was small enough to fit beneath a low spruce branch, and it sat with its knees pulled up like a kid, and it didn't move when the wind took a handful of snow across us. At first I thought it was a gopher mound with a trick of shadow. Then it turned its head. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like a person who had practiced stillness for a long time. My cousin was nowhere to be seen. The figure's face, if it had a face, was mostly a shadow, but the dog refused to look away. He pressed himself into the snow, tail tucked like he was trying to be smaller. I called for my cousin and the sound echoed wrong, like it was swallowed by the flat. No answer. The figure stood up slow, like it had used all its limbs together. Then it walked in a straight line toward the tree line between us and the river. It didn't come toward the sled. It went behind the trees and sat again under a dead spruce. I started to worry. My cousin had a reputation for wandering off and getting silly, but not for disappearing so quick. I went after him, taking my shotgun, though it felt useless, more a talisman for me than anything else. The snow was soft underfoot and my breath came out in short bursts. I had to step carefully. There are places you can sink a boot and only realize too late. When I reached the spruce line, the trees had a way of rearranging the paths. The figure was gone. No footprints either, only a faint print where something small had Saturday. There were human marks near the river where my cousin's sled had been, and fresh smears where someone had dragged a pack, but no body, no sign of a struggle. Just the sled half-tipped and packed with bait sacks that had been pulled open. I spent that night making a careful ring of fire and calling until my voice went raw. We found tracks the next morning moving away from the river in an odd pattern, like someone had walked, then stepped backwards, then walked again. They ended at the edge of a shallow creek where the water cut a line through the snow. Beyond that, the ground opened into muskeg and drift, and the prints seemed to peter out. People in the village said the weather could erase a trail in a night or a breeze could cover it, but I knew better. These prints stopped. They didn't blur. They stopped. The story that spreads around our homes about those little people is old. Old ladies and hunters warn kids not to leave food out when the tundra folk are around, because they take things and they take people as payment for old debts. We had joked about that story when we were small, the same way you joke about wolves and the cold, but something in me felt like we had crossed a boundary that year. I was 16. My cousin was careful and steady. He would not have walked into muskeg on purpose. He would not have crawled into a hole in the ground. He was the kind of person who fixed things and kept things tidy. The sled was found, the bait pulled, his jacket left on a stump like someone had shrugged it off. The search lasted 3 days. We found some of his gear out by a moss patch, gloves, a frozen cigarette pack. No sign of him. On the 4th day, a hunter from another camp came back with a story, but it was hard to say if it was meant to comfort us or to twist the knife. He said he'd seen a small light moving over the distant hills that night, like a handheld lamp, bobbing slow. Then he'd seen something small that ran across the ridge and dropped down the far side. He'd heard a laugh. The laugh was not a wolf sound, not a human laugh, but higher and gutless, like a bell that had been left out too long in the rain. We kept searching all through the winter. We put flyers up at the supply drop. The radio channels all said the same thing. We're looking. We're looking. I learned to quiet myself when people came by, how to make the small talk stop fast and not give away the way the hush sat in our house. I started to wake up with the image of that small figure sitting on the hummock, and it would sit there until the room cooled. No one ever found him. Years later, my cousin just never came back to the village. His family moved south. Sometimes I run into someone in the store downtown who will ask about that winter as if they mean the weather. They don't press. People who grew up are careful with the things they say loud. I moved out the next spring, and I think part of me left a piece of trust up there on the tundra. The dog that had been with us that night never looked out at the hummocks again. I never saw the figure again. But once, years later, when I was driving back up to visit my sister, I saw small tracks along the service road, like children's boot prints but too close together, and they led to a place where the snow had been disturbed in a tight circle and then nothing. I stopped the truck and I waited. I called my cousin's name, not as a prayer but like a test. The only answer was the wind and a small, quick laugh from the tree line that might have been a jay or a person. I couldn't say. I turned the truck around and went home.